Welcome back to our symposium. It's good to see you here. Today we're going to talk about decolonizing the food system, and we're super thrilled to be joined by Zoe Adjonyoh. Hi Zoe, from London.
Hello everyone.
So Zoe is a chef, author and food justice activist based in London. She's been cooking and selling food for about 10 years now. And her cookbook, Zoe's Ghana Kitchen, came out recently. She's also one of the founders of Black Book, which is a global representation platform for Black and non-white people working within hospitality and food media. And Black Book have been hosting a series of conversations on decolonizing the food system as well. So I'm very excited that Zoe is here today to share some insights on that. And I'm just going to make a few service announcements. So Zoe is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will have about 15 minutes for questions from you guys. If you want to ask any questions, you can type them in the chat. You will find this chat symbol below. Or you can also ask them directly, which is a little bit more personal, so that you can just turn on your video so that we know you have a question to ask, or you can let us know in the chat. And also this talk is being recorded. Afterwards, we will share the recording and a few further resources in our event app. As well as a few reading recommendations and further things to watch. We also invite you to quickly introduce yourself in the chat so that we see who else is here. So yeah, please just write your name and what you do very briefly. If you want to connect with some people directly, you can chat with them. You can send them a direct message. And if you have any technical questions or issues, you can send me a direct message. I'm Carla, but my name here is Die Gemeinschaft. So over to you, Zoe. I'm passing the virtual mic.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak at this symposium. So just to very quickly repeat some of what has been said, my name is Zoe Adjonyoh. I am a chef, writer, food justice activist, entrepreneur, multi-hyphenate human that cares about food. So I've been asked to speak on, sorry, I should say, I'm the founder of Zoe's Ghana Kitchen and Sankofa. So there's food businesses that I operate, and Black Book I'm a co-founder of, which is a platform for promoting diversity on a global scale in the food industry and in hospitality. So there we are. Now, I've been asked to speak on a very broad topic, which is decolonizing the food industry. It's going to be really important for you to understand that I, nor Black Book, have all the answers to the very, very many questions that do need to be solved and answered in the near future. So I think this is going to be more an exploration of what are the right questions to be asking as much as what are some of the solutions. I'm also going to try and do this to try and distill it through a bit more of a specific lens, because decolonizing the food industry is obviously a huge subject. So I'm going to focus today on what it might look like to to decolonize our diets specifically, right? Because I'm a food person, I'm a chef, I have a food business, so that's my lens. So let's start there. This is the concept of decolonizing the food industry is this kind of multifaceted problem that affects us all on a global level. So the solutions can be micro, and the solutions can be macro, right? But what we do understand is that they kind of need to be constantly evolving and adapting at a pace which is equal to, or which resonates with at least, this kind of pace with which the wider global consciousness on the topics is being raised, and also, just in terms of the literal environment of how food production and services is changing, not least because of the current pandemic we're in, and climate change and other concerns. But so let's start with some of the big questions, right? I mean, over the course of 8 weeks in the Decolonizing the Food Industry series with Black Book, we tackled some big subjects. We tackled publishing, agriculture, food writing, the media in general, awards, ceremonies. And we found consistently in each week over 8 weeks, talking to an international panel, that the same problems were coming up, right? So let's try and distill those problems into some questions that need to be, or problems that need to be solved. So, for example, how do we increase the vitality and the visibility of the oppressed and indigenous people, right, in various countries around the world that might be being exploited for their food production? How do we maintain the integrity of ancestral traditions? How do we embrace food and ways of cooking that resist kind of subjugation or to the white gaze, and instead nourish our palates, bodies, and lives in ways that feel true to us, not just through this specific lens that's been created historically? How do we make sense of the different realities, right, of lived food experiences? So, we need to take into account the influences of power and privilege, and what changes geographically, and over time, how that changes. And how might we think through the intersections of the diaspora, colonialism, assimilation, generational differences, gentrification, culinary appropriation, cultural appropriation. These are all intersections at which we have to be considering all of these questions and issues. So as I said, it's a big subject. Obviously, we're not going to get to all the answers today. We're not even going to get to all the questions, honestly, today. But if we understand that there is at the heart of all of this an intersectional problem, then we also know that the solution must demand we use an intersectional approach to answer them. So that's audience participation, the consumer, the people who participate in the food system, and also this kind of multi-sensory approach. It's not just one thing. It's how we grow, it's how we eat, it's how we buy, it's how we taste, it's how we describe. So, my examples and anecdotes will naturally be framed within the context of my own work, which has been focused on West African cuisine for the last 10 years. So in 2012, I spoke of us being at the time, I was speaking of the global north, predominantly the UK and USA, us being on the cusp of an African food revolution. That was me describing what I felt was a time where a group of people who were trying to make West African food more prominent, I was trying to encourage people to join that revolution. And many did, and many have, and many still continue to do. And the movement has indeed arrived. And yet still, 10 years later, I'm finding myself speaking of Africa as the last frontier of food exploration, something still to be discovered, right? And so why is that, we might ask? What hasn't happened in the last 10 years that there's still this kind of insistence in the UK industry anyway, that this is still a trend, right? So the struggles and strategies of decolonization are married to, just to summarize what's gone before, are married to this idea of how food is produced, consumed, circulated, prepared, and represented. And that is all done within this kind of transnational global economy, if you like, and advanced capitalism at the end of the day is the real thing. So unpicking all of this is what it will take to liberate our diets from colonial relationships of production and consumption as we know it so far. And, one of the biggest problems we found over 8 weeks, or we decided was, we thought this at the beginning and it was true at the end, is that the largest issue is the problem of systemic racism in the culture of the food industry generally. So now by that, I'm not suggesting that everybody who works in food is racist. That's not what this is saying. It's the assertion, rather, that very few in the industry have taken the time or effort to consider the impact of colonialism on our current food systems. And that speaks to everything that's just been listed in terms of all of those questions I've already mentioned. So what do I mean by the culture? So the culture of the food industry is the environment, right? If you distill it to its essence, when we talk of culture, we really mean the environment we grow up in and are surrounded by. So it's who and what we are surrounded by to influence our values, our beliefs, our customs, our perception, our ideologies that affect how we live our lives and the choices that we make. So in the absence of any Black or non-white people in this senior decision-making roles across the board, no matter what part of the food industry or system we're talking about, there is going to be inherently a lack of Black culture and perspective in that gaze, no matter where and how it's applied. So that's one of our key areas to address is leadership. As I said, so there's not one answer because there's not one problem. You know, it's multifaceted and layered, and it depends on which branch of the industry you work in, you know, what will affect what the solutions may be for your particular part of the industry. You have to forgive me now because I'm going to get a little woo-woo, as we say, a little bit spiritual. So from a spiritual or even a basic philosophical perspective, you know, you could argue that there is an abundance, right, in the world. We have an abundance of the things that we as humans need to survive in terms of a food system. Again, I'm distilling this down to super basic level stuff, but that's always a good place to start, I think. So in its simplest form, what does a food system need and for us to consume from it? We need water, oxygen, light, right? They're the things we use to grow food and ingredients. So if we were all to follow a more spiritual life, we might say that the ingredients, an abundant supply of these things, you know, from the crops themselves to the wealth creation possible from growing those crops and the sale of subsequent processed foods made from those crops. If we were to have, let's say, a better appreciation and gratitude for the fact that these things are available to us, then possibly we wouldn't waste these things, because in the process of practicing daily gratitude, just by virtue of being grateful, we would inherently be more mindful. And in that mindfulness comes curiosity, right? And so we would be curious about where they come from and who made them. And therefore we would care more. Yeah, for far too long, all of these things have been taken for granted and exploited just for greed, you know, and fast consumerism. So that's just one kind of really basic, simple concept of how an individual might change their relationship with the food system, just gratitude, right? An obvious consequence of a lack of gratitude is our man-made climate change crisis we have right now. And Liz Calvo, the co-author of Decolonizing Your Diet, which was a Mexican-American plant-based cookbook, came out in 2013, kind of reinforces my woo-woo moment here, because she's saying, having gratitude, offering blessings, and recognizing the labor that went into the food, grounding ourselves in gratitude and appreciation as a daily practice can be vital towards food decolonization. So there you go. I'm not completely woo-woo. So she's saying that we can take such small personal steps, whether that's you know, just blessing your food every day or giving gratitude, giving thanks, however you interpret that. It's one of the small steps, right, in ways individuals can decolonize how they eat. But we can't take that in isolation, and nor should we. So we also have to think about taking an active stance of solidarity with the people who make that food, who grow that food, who pick that food, who process that food. So on one hand, we can learn about the food we're eating and the labor that we've made it possible to come to the table. But because everything is intersectional and connected, we also have to think about what are the political elements here, and what are the effects on the environment and planet. So that's when you bring in sustainability and all of those other ideas. And again, and then we have to come back to colonialism. So America and Europe have this kind of complex colonial history, right? Having run riot around the world for many hundreds of years, and still having interests in some countries around the world, many of these, the UK being one, France being another, they still have interests in their kind of Commonwealth countries. So we have to just start being more aware in a general sense of how politics and history have fed into the system that we have now. I'm going to give you what I consider hopefully a good example of this. So Zoe's Ghana Kitchen for the last 10 years operated essentially as a catering business, right? I had a restaurant, I did pop-ups, I did supper clubs, we did catering, we did mobile street food, all of the kind of avenues with which you would deliver a food service is what Zoe's Ghana Kitchen used to do. And obviously I had a cookbook as well. Now, my whole bit for the last 10 years was this concept of bringing African food to the masses, right? That was the mission statement. And it was kind of naively meant to be a vehicle for decolonizing the food industry because, you know, I may not have had the lexicon for that at the time, but, excuse me, there was inherently this kind of idea behind it that was making West African food so popular that it would come into the mainstream, which would then mean the possibility of wealth creation for the producers of Ghanaian food exports, right? Whilst at the same time, educating people about these amazing flavors and health benefits, and to give those ingredients visibility in the same way as sort of European and global North staple ingredients. And therefore giving equality in the positioning of West African or African food. So framing it in the same way as Indian or, you know, modern American, modern British, French, Italian, and so on. So I had this big idea that would also create equity because there was this desire to inspire a new generation to take part in this revolution and to celebrate their culture through food. So this other idea was about equity and for those people to take a stake in this new economy of African gastronomy before it became whitewashed, because I was very aware that it was inevitable that a white gaze would eventually come to this area of undiscovered cuisine. And because of having better resource financially and manpower, we'd be able to monetize what would have been, you know, the hard backbreaking work of those of us who had to work to establish it as a cuisine. The naivety was huge there because while I was telling the world to cook with these ingredients and become acquainted with these flavors, big business was also listening, right? So, and you know, and that has, you know, the negative loop has been fulfilled because now in West Africa, you know, the big multinationals, whether it's Unilever or Monsanto or any of those people, have been buying up all of the crops and the land on which you might grow the crops in West Africa of things like many of the ingredients that I advertise to use: alligator peppers, guinea peppers, bambara beans, fonio, those kind of ingredients, which are being kind of bought up in such huge, vast amounts. It's displacing the natural ecosystem for import and export. It's displacing cooperative farming. It's disrupting an entire food chain. And also, the long-term effect of that is probably that it's outpricing Ghanaians from their own food culture, their ability to buy their own food. And I've witnessed some of that myself, being in markets where it's really hard in Accra to find indigenous ingredients because the crops have all been brought up for resale to the global North or the West. Which has, okay, I'm going to come back to that. So that's just to show that this kind of circularity of this problem isn't new, it's not going away, right? So let's look at decolonization as a framework for a new food system, because if we have been inherently excluded from the gaze which has decided what the point of view is in terms of how we write about it, how we pay people, how we tell the story of where the food comes from and who grew it and so on, then we have to think about these bigger issues. So yeah, we do have to acknowledge that the farm workers are being exploited in the fields, and we have to understand that indigenous people are being denied access to their own land and to grow their own food. But there's more, right? The story of the producers and essential workers in the system, the land itself, the growers, the pickers, their value in the food supply chain, including biodiversity, sustainability, labour rights, wealth creation, all of that. The exploitation of the climate and pollution that's affecting that as well. Denying people the space to grow and sell their own food. You know, the Chinese kind of third wave colonialism that's happening all across Africa right now. This is one example. And then authenticity, right? This is this other big idea that everybody wants to know what's authentic. And that's a colonial idea, you know. What did our diets look like before before they were colonized? 400 years ago, what were Ghanaians eating, you know? You have to really go back in history very, very far to deconstruct authentic. So what has been added in by the global north that we now consider normal? Like, so here's some examples. I mean, moving on from like the spice trade and obviously cash cropping by slave owners and things like that, just in this kind of current context, we might talk about the fact that there's this famous dish in Ghana called wache, which includes, you know, some rice, a spicy sauce, boiled egg, a stew, another spicy sauce, and then it has noodles on the plate, Indomie noodles, which obviously aren't Ghanaian. But if you were to try to serve a Ghanaian today wache without noodles, they will say, well, this isn't wache. But those noodles have come from out of Africa into Africa. And that's like the new normal that's been decided. Same with basmati. If you want to cook jollof, for example, a lot of people will say to me, you know, it's not jollof if you're not using basmati. Well, basmati is not indigenous to Africa. It's a cash crop grain. So, you know, then we have this other tricky problem, like around traditional authenticity and all of that. Excuse me. Then we have to also consider the food guardians, right? Guardians, of which I might be one, right? Because I'm a food writer. So the writers, the cooks, the chefs, where and how much is the compromise between delivering what we consider authentic against the environment we're in? You know, and also in the environment or the gaze, which kind of seeks authenticity from us as the other, but then demands that we strip the ingredients out and replace them with suitable alternatives. Another problem. Then there's language itself. After Mandarin, isn't English the global language now? Colonialism is inherently in the thread of what we speak, how we describe what we want to say, and how we are allowed to say it, you know? And that's before we even get into the problem of who decides what a recipe should look like, or who decides how you should measure when you write a recipe, or the quantity and how you describe the quantity, and how much context you set into the storytelling part, the head note. So all of our modern language has been created through the perception of a white gaze. So how do we then unlearn this and expand our consciousness around language and narrative, around storytelling itself? I mean, this is just all homework that we all have to do, really. And then, oh my goodness. Apologies. Then there's this kind of obsession with trends and fetishizing, the fetishizing of world foods, you know, which is just this kind of continuous othering that goes on, which is in itself inherently racist, even whether it's meant to be or not. So, you know, I asked earlier, why 10 years later, after an African food revolution in the UK, are West African chefs, writers, restaurants, and everybody involved in that piece in the UK still trending rather than being established fixtures on the food scene? You know, when does it stop trending? When does it stop being a trend? Do we have to wait for white people to tell us, oh, it's not a trend anymore, it's just as normal as Italian and French? I don't know. The purchasing decisions of consumers, you know, consumers have to learn that they're perhaps buying from a culture outside of their own, and they should maybe be thinking about who grew those ingredients, who packed them, who's selling them, and who's benefiting from the sale of them. You know, is there any money going back to the people who grew that food, or are they being exploited? Then there's the education around health benefits of those ingredients beyond what the white world want to sell us, right? Because that is also like health and wellness has become a very white gazed industry. As I wrote about leadership and all the positions of decision making. So we want to see at board level, you know, we need to create cultures for change and inclusion, or more accurately, we need to think of that space in the same way as anti-racism. You know, we need to think of anti-colonialism at board level. It's like, how do we undo 400 years of oppressive point of view? And then there's more questions and more questions. So, you know, it's really for each of us to examine what are the micro and macro changes we can make over time to affect meaningful change when it comes to this subject. And yeah, I'm really sorry. The press are continually trying to get me to give an answer. There isn't an answer. There's lots of questions. There's lots of problems. And there's lots of answers. And it's going to take a huge accumulation of people engaging with the questions in order to find the answers for themselves, because it is a responsibility of everybody. You don't have to be the head of Unilever to engage in this. You are a consumer. We all consume. We can choose where to buy, where to eat, what to make, how to make it. They're all choices. But it's very, you know, it's not a short solved problem. It's a long-term problem. And it has to be this kind of intersectional solution. And so for my part, it's outside of Black Book, because I'm coming to speak on Black Book specifically later on in the week. So in the context of Zoe's Ghana Kitchen, what we've done is change the platform from catering to an online shop so that I don't have to replace the true flavour and ingredients of a dish, because if people want to buy the authentic or cook the authentic real thing, they can find those ingredients from me, from my shop. Here's my recipe, here are the ingredients, go wild, have fun. There's no need for you to try and find an alternative, because here's the real thing. So that's one aspect. The second aspect of that is the fact that I do have direct relationships with the farms and growers in West Africa. So I'm cutting out the supply chain, which means that I know that the farm itself is getting paid appropriately for the ingredients. I also know that there's nobody in the middle making money off of this process or exploiting anybody on either end. I also know that I'm a Black-owned business selling Black-owned products. So there's some authority in that, right? And also on that website, I'm educating people about the health benefits of said ingredients. So it's trying to be its own ecosystem here. So it's doing the piece of telling the consumer there's a problem in the About Us section. It's telling them why I care about the problem, setting out a vision and purpose around the concept of decolonizing to raise their own awareness of the issue in the first place, and then encouraging them to, you know, make new decisions around the purchasing, the cooking, and sourcing of ingredients. And that's where I'm at with Zoe's Ghana Kitchen at the moment, in a pandemic, whilst also trying to operate another business. But there you go. So to conclude, I guess, is what I'm saying, and I'm sorry to have left more questions probably than answers, but that is where we're at. You know, this is even though that cookbook came out in 2013, and decolonizing isn't a new concept or idea, of course, but there is a certain urgency that is demanded now, especially in the context of Black Lives Matter, especially in the context of where we are with the environment, and especially where we are in the context of poor leadership globally around the world on all of these issues. And it's going to be an amalgamation of everybody at all areas, at all levels, having a think about all of those questions I mentioned and thinking, well, what can I do? And that's it. I hope I spent 30 minutes. Sorry about my throat. It's become very dry.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Yeah, sorry about your throat. I hope you're feeling okay.
I'm fine. I don't know why that happened to me.
Yeah, no worries. So thank you so much for this little introduction into decolonizing the food system. Obviously, yes, it's such a big topic, and also, as you said, it's such it's like an ongoing process of which we're just at the beginning. So yeah, but still, it's super interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and also to hopefully continue this conversation afterwards. If anybody has any questions, you can either ask them directly by turning on your camera and unmuting yourself, or doing a sign or anything that will make us aware that you have a question. Otherwise, you can also type it in the chat if you're a little bit more shy or don't want to turn on your camera, that's fine. So yeah, let us know. Otherwise, I also have a few questions still. I'm curious about, because you're such a central figure from what I perceive in the London food scene, I'm a bit curious about how it was when it started and maybe the feedback you received, and how it has evolved over the years with Zoe's Ghana Kitchen.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I wasn't sure if you meant Zoe's Ghana Kitchen or Black Book.
Yeah.
How it was received in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
It was received well because there wasn't anything like it at the time, which was a contemporary concept around West African food. So I created my own niche, if you like, in one respect, but also perhaps my own noose. But yeah, it was received very well because it was a new idea in terms of, well, you know, new ideas, nothing's ever new, but there hadn't yet been this kind of bridge, if you like. I'm going to call Zoe's Ghana Kitchen a bridge for people to walk over between West Africa and whatever experience of food that they were up until then experiencing. So world foods up until that point might have been, the extent could have been Thai, Vietnamese, you know, sort of Southeast Asia and South American foods, Peru, Mexico. But yeah, you know, and it was received well and it has had a good journey, Zoe's Ghana Kitchen, but obviously, you know, we're living through a pandemic, and everybody who works in the food industry knows how that's affected the hospitality industry very badly. So, you know, there is partial motivation there in speeding up this process, because I was going to be changing Ghana Kitchen to an online shop anyway, but my plan was to do that at the end of the year. So, you know, events over the last 6 months just basically made me speed up that decision, and yeah, it's going very well right now. I think, you know, I think it's hard to tell consumers as well with blunt honesty what the situation is, but I feel at this point is at now that we're at, I don't really have time to be polite about it. And you know, I've just submitted my last recipe that I've put a substitution in for, and I made the publication aware of why I won't be writing for them anymore. And, you know, I'm happy, you know, these are the choices I make, right? It's like, I'm going to be direct with my consumers. If they trust me and they believe the same things as me, they'll come with me. If they don't, hopefully they'll have learned something, and, you know, they'll go on their way and hopefully learn something else somewhere else. But these are just small things, right? Small things with big ideas behind them. And I think it's the aggregate of these small things that will change the consumer's mind. And when you change the consumer's mind, then you have to change the producer's mind, because they will have to consider the things that consumer cares about.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of kind of small things, or everybody doing their part, since this is also a conference for mostly people who work in the food industry, and many of them own businesses, what would you advise, or what do you think would be the top steps to take in order to support these decolonization strategies?
I mean, there isn't, I think this is the other thing about solution-based kind of thinking, which it's more, you know, if you're working in the food industry, you should probably already have a good sense of what specific to your business is an issue. You know, if you are kind of if you are a food writer and you write recipes out of your culture, perhaps you should be consulting with somebody from within the culture to make sure that actually you're really representing that culture properly. You should be doing research around, you know, not just whether the dish tastes good, but what's the history of it? Where's it come from? How's it been translated? How many iterations have we gone through to get it to how you're showing it to us now, right? So there's some responsibility there. For example, if you're a restaurant or, you know, directly serving customers food, where are you sourcing? You know, are you interrogating your suppliers about their practices and what's sustainable and what you know, provenance and what's going into the food you're serving? You know, it's very bespoke depending. You know, the food industry is massive. You know, you could be a food stylist or a food photographer, but it doesn't matter where in the scheme you are. I'm 99% sure there's going to be some aspect of what you do or how you do it, or the ecosystem within which you perform your role, that could be tweaked a little more to serve this idea better.
And
maybe I should charge for one-to-one consulting so I could do Decol your business with Zoe Adjonyoh. But yeah, look, it's a workshop. You know, that's why we've got a consultancy arm for Black Book, because it's impossible to give one solution to everybody. Yeah. Everybody's got a different situation depending on who they are. And I think the main thing really is that conferences, people are engaged in the conversation, you know, and that was part of the reason for the Decol series we did. And I'm sure that's part of the reason why you're putting this symposium on as well, is to have an engaging conversation so that the issues can come up. And the more the issues come up, the easier it will be to find the solutions. And as you say, you know, whilst the concept decolonizing the food industry is not a new idea, we are still at the baby steps of even considering what the questions and problems are. And that 8 weeks of talks we did for Black Book only, you know, scratched the surface, really, of any of the questions and issues within it. But that's the important part, is to start and to take some action.
Yeah, and I was wondering, because this year there's been such a massive or relatively big attention on these issues of systemic racism, and I'm also wondering, what can we do for it not to disappear again after a few months? Because, you know, it comes in waves and then all of a sudden it's gone. And it's a bit what you were saying about, yeah, being just a trend.
Right. Yeah, and again, that's about all of us not letting it just die, right? It's about keeping the conversation open, keeping the conversation inclusive, and keeping the conversation ongoing, I think, is the point. This isn't something that is going to get solved in a year or 10 years or 20 or 30. This is kind of just how it's going to be for the rest of time. It could take 400 years, right, to unpick really what the legacy of colonialism. Because look, I'm here speaking English to you, you're speaking English to me. I'm Irish African. I think you might be German.
French and German.
French, German, yeah. So I thought, I wasn't sure if I should say French or not. But you know what I mean? So it's like, in that context alone, there's the struggle, you know, because every single word has been picked from a point of view that definitely excludes my experience and my ancestors' experience. So I'm not suggesting that we will have to abandon the English language, but I'm just saying that's how deep we need to be considering the issue. Because even when it comes to, you know, one of the things that came up regularly around this concept of story and narrative and who gets to tell the story and who and how and all of that. And that's actually really important because, you know, storytelling is a tradition in lots of cultures, African culture, Irish culture, all cultures really have this kind of way of passing down histories and information and culture through story. And yet somehow at some point, somebody somewhere decided that no, the ideal format for a recipe is a short head note, no more than 100 words, and it must have quantity, it must be laid out like this, and it must do that. You know, this spec for a recipe was decided by somebody who is out of fully within their own culture and context, right? Which is fine, but then why are we applying it to everybody else's culture and context at the same time? So it's like, yeah, I mean, the truth is, until every single part of the system has a board level, until the stakeholders of each company become enlightened, let's say, and more inclusive and diverse in the makeup of them, then we're only going to get secondhand decolonizing work. Do you know what I mean? It's not going to shift anything massively if we don't have a black or non-white perspective that can lean into some of these ideas and even appreciate or inherently know them without having to be told what they are. Then it's going to take a very long time, which is why we have this whole other narrative running of, okay, well, if these systems don't work and they're bad, let's create new systems that sit alongside them. We can borrow and cherry pick the good bits if we want to, and then build out what does community around food look like? What does sustainability around food look like? What does food writing look like for us? What does good leadership in food industry look like for us? You know, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And could you also maybe tell us a bit about because I was reminded during your talk of the opening talk we had with Selassie Tadika from Ghana, and she was also she was explaining a lot of very interesting things about kind of fast food taking over the food culture in Ghana, and so I was wondering how close are you in touch with what's happening in Ghana, and maybe can you tell us a bit about what kind of neo-colonial structures look like on that side, because it's very different from UK to Ghana. Obviously, it's two sides of one story.
Of course. And Selassie and I are friends, actually, and we have spoken at length together on this topic. I think even, the last time I was in Accra, 2018, I was in fact, I think I might have started the conversation. I was talking to Selassie about the fact that I couldn't find millet in some local markets I'd been to, and I couldn't find some particular local spices and ingredients like dawa, things like that. And all of my sort of chef community friends in Accra all said to me that, oh yeah, it's really hard to find these things now. And, you know, one of the reasons was this, the moment I touched on about, big multinationals coming and buying up land and crops and stuff like that. But the flip side is this ex-colonial adoration of being colonialized, you know, it's kind of this brainwashed colonialism. And then you have a new middle class in Accra, it seems, who want to align more with Western food, Western culture, because they think it's, you know, it's associated with wealth, it's associated with success, like these kind of Western standards of food and food dining and stuff. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with aspiration. That's not a problem, of course. But when people are in such high numbers, not cooking their own food and kind of looking down on chop bars and the places where you would naturally inherently eat amazing local food because they're going to French and Italian restaurants, and because there isn't anybody in Accra doing a good modern version, well, that's not true because Selassie is, but, you know, in the mainstream, there isn't enough people, let's say. And people are buying loads of shit, junk, fast food, and like the chicken is being imported from China and it's terrible quality, you know, and it's horrifying that that's happening. But it's about media influence, right? It's the media influence that tells Ghanaians what success and money and good is, and they don't ever see West African food on a Netflix series of Chef's Table. They don't ever see Ghanaian people on MasterChef, you know, killing the game. So if we don't see ourselves in this kind of higher regard, it's, of course, it's problematic. And, you know, and both of those things are linked as well, because if Ghanaian people are shunning Ghanaian food, they're going to care less and less about the fact that their crops and land are being bought out by people who aren't Ghanaian. And before you know it, you've got this kind of a new kind of desert, if you like. There's a desert of the ability to grow and farm and produce your own food, and that is like one of the most basic things I think every human should want to be able to do, to grow your own food, or at least have some space to do it. So yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's all linked together. And yeah, I'm very proud of Selassie for taking up that mantle in her world tour of the world, talking about these issues.
Yeah, it also reminds me of this theory, I think it was published in the 80s, about decolonizing mind, which is such an essential part of, I mean, yeah, it's not enough to like to do it on paper. It's also still, yeah, in the mentality of people that you need to do a lot of work. Yeah,
it is a lot. It's a huge amount of work to do, and that's which might feel overwhelming, but also, as an entrepreneur, I can say that, big things happen through lots of small actions on the way. And that's just how we have to treat this problem, because it's a problem. And the solutions are many and multiple, and they are layered. And they're within the hands of the consumer, they're within the hands of the producers, they're within the hands of big agribusiness, they're in the hands of the food media, they're within the hands of culinary schools. Everybody could be doing something differently to improve where we are now. And if everybody engages with a little bit every day, then we'll go faster.
And how did you, because you were talking about building relationships with the producers in Ghana, could you tell us a bit about that and how you managed to build that?
I mean, the internet is a great thing, isn't it? Research and network, and asking, chefs and restaurants I know and I'm friends with, and I'm not friends with in some cases. Not that we're not friends, but I didn't know them before. I just made inquiries like, do you know any good, sustainable small co-ops, small holdings, organic farms in Nigeria and Ghana and Togo and Benin that are supplying you? Because up until this point, I was being supplied obviously by traditional wholesalers. There aren't many, obviously, West African specific wholesalers in the UK or in London even. And so for sort of specialist ingredients, I was probably going to markets myself, like Ridley Road Market or Brixton or Peckham or wherever it was, or indeed just kind of ordering generically off online, but also aware that, definitely not wanting to do that, because knowing that these products weren't being sold by Black-owned businesses. So the short answer is I reached out to people and asked questions and found answers, and that's how that happened.
Okay, yeah. Yay for the internet.
Yeah, good old Google.
Yeah.
I'm trying to sell Ecosia these days. Ecosia, they plant trees every time you do a search. So
yeah. It's I didn't want to advertise for Google. Okay, so if there's no questions from participants, again, just feel free to, don't be shy, feel free to type something in the chat or to raise your hand. There's a little hand symbol next to your name in the participants list. But if there aren't any further questions,
everyone's gone to sleep.
Yeah.
Is it that bad? Come on, guys, wake up. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to be mindful of your time. So I will thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. And also we're really looking forward to seeing you again on October 26th at 6 p.m. again, where you will be joined by Anna Sulan-Masing to talk more about Black Book and the work you do there. Apart from that, the symposium continues this week with 2 other talks. We have one in about half an hour at 7:30 with Andrea Gruda, where is hospitality heading with Corona, which will be in German. And then tomorrow at 6, we're talking with the two founders of Frisch Gefischt from Hamburg about if and how fishing can be sustainable. So we hope to see you there. And if you want to connect with the other participants of the symposium, feel free to also register on our networking platform called Stammtisch. You will find the link on our website under Join Us, and also in the emails we've sent you about the symposium. So yeah, thank you so much, Zoe, and see you soon again, and have a good evening.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope it was useful. All right, speak soon.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.